Imagine the sexual tension. It's January 1788. The First Fleet has been at sea for 9 months with strict orders that the male and female convicts should be kept apart. They've just arrived here at Sydney Cove and they're about to come ashore. What happened next? I've embarked on a journey across space and time. We're going to try and recreate that moment. Australia started as a social experiment. Convicts, can you mount the gangplank, please? So I'm looking for clues to explain what made this eclectic and sometimes eccentric nation what it is today. That is the real ancient and magical story of Australia. In this episode, I'm exploring the dangerous days of early settlement. If you attempt to get into the women's tents of a night, you will be fired upon. It's a story of sex.
There is no doubt, Tony, I'm afraid it was a serious orgy.
Convicts made good.
He was transported, yes.
And you're proud of it, aren't you?
Well, I am.
And two cultures colliding. He identified a likely-looking Aboriginal and kidnapped him. I'll learn the extraordinary story of a war that was never declared.
By the time the pistol went off, he'd been hit by a pen with a spear.
And what happened once the new colony emerged from chaos.
It's grim.
Oh, wait for it. Oh. Sydney's Royal Botanic Gardens are just around the corner from where the 11 ships of Captain Arthur Phillip's First Fleet dropped anchor in the summer of 1788. The fleet was moored just behind where the Sydney Opera House is now, and the very first people to be sent ashore were the male convicts. They were tasked with clearing all the trees and putting up the tents and digging the latrines. In other words, in creating the beginnings of the very first colony. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to recreate that first colony with the help of Tim Flannery, eminent author and historian. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Tony. Great to meet you.
And also some passers-by. If you wouldn't mind moving all this stuff, setting up the colony over there, OK? Presumably it would have been a lovely sunny day when the first colony was being built.
Well, there was storms on the horizon, I think, because we know that later that evening all hell broke loose.
When you say all hell, what kind of hell?
One of those thunderstorms that only a place like Sydney can put on. It just feels like the end of the world. Lightning, thunder, rain that you can hardly see through.
It does seem a bit mad to have let the men off the ship and then wait 11 days till the women were allowed out.
Well, look, the women were terribly troublesome. They were so difficult to handle that the sailors were given an extra ration of rum when they were let off. So yeah. I guess they had to have things sorted out before they let them free. A great bolt of lightning came down, hit the sentry on duty, blinded him, killed 5 of the colony's sheep, and of course all of the people in authority were basically cowering on the ships offshore, and the sailors came ashore, and what are we going to do with the extra rum? I know what, let's go into the women's tents. So the scene that was developing here and was observed between the flashes of lightning were drunken sailors, drunken women, doing who knows what in the mud and having a great party, basically.
Do you think there really was an orgy, or do you think that's a bit of a gloss that storytellers added later on?
There is no doubt, Tony, I'm afraid it was a serious orgy. You've just got to read Ralph Clark's words, Lieutenant Ralph Clark, who he said, you know, what a scene of whoredom is there ashore, that presumably he'd watched between the lightning bolts, people rutting in the mud and who knows what.
What I find so extraordinary is that you've got this incredible 21st century city now, and yet it all started with a bit of this. OK, you lot over there, start shagging. That was the beginning of Sydney, and it hasn't looked back since. The new colony certainly started with a bang, and while everyone was shocked, no one was surprised. Least of all British Marine Watkin Tench, who wrote, "What was to be attempted? To prevent their intercourse was impossible, and to palliate its evils only remained. Marriage was recommended." The next morning, Governor Phillip gathered all the fleet together. Officers, soldiers, sailors and convicts. The Navy man knew his authority had been compromised. In foul temper, he seized it back. "I'm now thoroughly convinced that nothing but severity will have any effect upon you to induce you to behave properly in the future. If you attempt to get into the women's tents of a night, you will be fired upon. In England, thieving poultry isn't punished with death, but here, where a loss of that kind cannot be replaced, it is of the utmost consequence to the settlement. Therefore, stealing the most trifling article of stock or provisions shall be punished with death." You miserable bastards. The governor made it perfectly clear that the new colony would be no picnic on the beach. But if his admonishment wasn't enough, the colony's top legal beak also had something to say. The hungover colonists are told they'll hear a statement from their king. And then Captain Collins, who was going to be the new judge advocate, read from this thing, which was called the Commission. And as you can see, they were incredibly long, and it said stuff like, "With these, our instructions, you will receive our commission under our Great Seal. We're appointing you to be our Captain General and Governor-in-Chief of our territory, extending from the northern cape or extremity of the coast called Cape York," blah, 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 for over an hour. And when he'd finished, that kicked off one of the biggest land grabs in the history of the British Empire. The British Crown had just claimed for itself more than 4 million square kilometres of New Holland, and the colony of New South Wales was born. The occasion was light on pageantry, but heavy with meaning, a fact that would probably have been lost on the convicts and the members of the Cadigal tribe watching bemused from a distance. What do you think the Aboriginals were really thinking when the Europeans arrived?
Obviously, there was a language barrier, so we couldn't ask them outright, "Are you here to stay?" or "How long are you staying for? When are you leaving?" So when the township of Sydney started to grow, I believe that was a real clue for Aboriginal people that they're not leaving anytime soon.
Tension between the two groups started pretty quickly, didn't it, when it became obvious they were competing for food?
Yeah, definitely. When the early colony first started to understand how Aboriginal people would use this food, they started to watch and copy and then start to eat all of the food. And then Aboriginal people were thinking, well, we've always made sure that there was enough for tomorrow, and you're just catching everything and eating it all. So that would have caused some animosity between the two camps for sure.
It was soon clear that these pale strangers weren't passing through. They were taking fish from the harbour, tearing up the environment, building solid huts. And this was just the beginning. From day one, the new colony was operating on borrowed time. Governor Phillip had only brought enough food to last 2 years, and there wasn't a decent farmer among them. Things only got worse when a drought hit in 1789. Here at Vaucluse House in Sydney, they now grow the crops of those early years with a lot of success. Jackie Newling's an expert on how they fed themselves in those early days.
You had a great labour force, 700 odd people, but they didn't have skilled farmers.
Why not?
Well, most of the convicts were urban crims. They hadn't had any connection with the land in their past. So there was a great void, if you like, in skill.
It seems like it was a big tactical mistake for the First Fleet not to bring out farmers.
It does rather. They arrived in summer, so of course that was the hottest time of the year, so a lot of the crops they first planted couldn't survive that heat, and there were several droughts over those first 5 years, actually. They felt they were starving.
Food was rationed, and the rations were meagre. But incredibly, Arthur Phillip decreed that equal amounts be given to officers and convicts alike. Hunger was blind in the eyes of the new governor.
That was a real thing for Phillip. He believed in parity. The only difference was the Marines got a tot of rum each day, which the convicts weren't allowed.
Why did they go to such an extent as to implement a ration system? It's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. First of all, it's a finite amount of food and you had to make it last. But it actually served a second purpose. As well as being food, it was a way of keeping check of your people. They had to be tied to the settlement for their food.
This is food as social control.
Absolutely. It was a type of mustering. In a jail without walls, if you controlled the food, then they had to stay within the settlement.
And this is what they got. Flour, salted pork, split peas, butter and rice. No fruit, barely a vegetable. It looks fine, doesn't it? Enough bulk for you to survive, but it doesn't look very interesting.
Well, it's actually surprising what you can make from this selection of ingredients. Got some samples up here if you like. Obviously, bread is your obvious one for flour, and the convicts were invited to hand their ration of flour into the central baker, and he would give them an equivalent weight loaf of bread.
What's this?
This is what we came to be known as a Johnny cake, sort of a homemade bread that you just make in hot coals.
God, it's a bit of a wrestle breaking a bit of this off.
Are you criticising my cooking?
No, I'm not. It's not bad at all, is it?
It's not too bad, and it's quite dense.
You're
and
telling
again,
me.
but again, good energy. This is sort of like your one-pot meal, a stew, flavoured by the meat, and with whatever greens you could lay your hands on, and little dumplings, again, made out of your flour ration.
Well, it's very salty, isn't it? Looks like a bit of a mistake. Philip had a crisis on his hands. The crops were failing, the weather was harsh and unpredictable. And with no fresh food or vegetables, diseases started to break out, scurvy and leg ulcers. 1789 came and went, and still no supply ship. 1790 arrived, by which time everyone had fallen into depression at the prospect of a slow starvation. And if ever there was a clap of thunder or a weapon was fired, everyone would shout, "Gun from a ship, gun from a ship," and they'd all race to the cliff edge and scour the horizon. But, of course, it never was a ship, until at last, on the 1st of April 1790, Philip was forced to cut the rations even more. The good news was you got more rice. The bad news was all the peas went, 2/3 of the flour went, all the butter, and that much meat. There wasn't much left. Foraging for food in the bush was a dangerous undertaking for the unarmed convicts. And stealing from the government store carried the death penalty. But hunger is a powerful motivator. Just a month after settlement, the convicted conman and forger Thomas Barrett was caught stealing provisions. That same afternoon, Barrett was marched down this very hill by the Marine garrison to his place of execution. The entire convict population had been ordered to gather on this street corner to witness this public demonstration of the folly of stealing food. The hangman was a young bloke called James Freeman, who'd also been sentenced to death for stealing food, but in his case, Philip had pardoned him, provided he was prepared to become the colony hangman. And James agreed, must have seemed like quite a good deal, except he didn't really want to be a hangman because he thought it would make all the other convicts hate him. Can't think why, but he did. So when it came to hanging Barrett, he wanted a stall, so he's fiddling around and generally wasting time, taking minute after minute after minute, till eventually Major Ross, who's the head of the Marines, threatens to shoot him dead unless he gets on with it. So suddenly James speeds up. Well, up until that moment, Barrett had been pretty relaxed because he thought he was going to be getting some kind of last-minute reprieve. Suddenly, he realises that that isn't going to happen, and he's terrified. So Freeman does the deed, Barrett's dead. The whole thing was a complete farce. I wonder what it says about a country where the first man hanged was also the creator of the colony's first work of art. While still on the ship that transported him from England, Barrett produced this exquisite little engraving, now known as the Charlotte Medal. He's said to have made it from the surgeon's kidney dish. On one side is an image of the Charlotte, on the other, an account of the long journey from Mother England to the far side of the world. It's a national treasure now, all the more so because the man who made it, like so many Australian folk heroes, found death at the hands of the authorities. But unruly convicts weren't Captain Phillip's only problem. He arrived with explicit orders to build relations with the natives of New Holland, who'd been described to him as timid and nomadic. But the Aborigines were avoiding the settlement and attacking anyone who strayed from it. The governor had to find ways to turn things around. But in order to do this, he did something which, to an 18th century British imperialist, might have seemed very sensible, but to us seems at best bizarrely unacceptable and at worst a criminal offence. He identified a likely-looking Aboriginal and kidnapped him. His name was Arabanu, and on New Year's Eve 1788, he was snatched from his tribe's territory in Manly and brought to the settlement in chains. The following day, Arabanu shared lunch with the colonial dignitaries at Government House, except the guest of honour was chained at the feet to prevent him from escaping. Imagine what the experience would have been like for him. Everything in the entire room would have been alien, including the knife and fork and the china service, virtually the only one in the entire colony which was put in front of him. He was even offered a glass of wine, which he thought was absolutely disgusting and declined. But like a lot of Aboriginals, he was a very good mimic and pretty quick on the uptake, so he managed to get through the entire meal without mishap, including the toast to the king, which he did with his glass of water. Philip felt quite satisfied with his first experiment in socialisation, but he couldn't have grasped how very differently his guest Arabanu saw the world. When he'd finished eating, like any Aboriginal who'd used a plate made out of a leaf or a bit of bark or something, he picked up his plate and started to throw it out of the window until he was grabbed by some of the guests and prevented from doing so. Imagine the feeling of amusement and consternation and slightly implied threat that the assembled multitude must have felt. There was curiosity and quite a bit of goodwill between the two groups in these early days, but a tragedy was about to unfold that would change that profoundly. Arabanu, the Aboriginal man captured by Captain Phillip, lived at the governor's house for almost 6 months, although the majority of that time he remained in irons. What do you reckon Arabanu felt about all this?
Oh, boy, that is the million-dollar question. I can't really get into the man's mind because he was kidnapped, which is obviously a violent thing to happen to him, but then was brought in and treated with great kindness by these strange beings. There was a belief among Aboriginal people that the Europeans were ancestors who'd come back, and perhaps he thought he was among his ancestors. We don't know.
For the first year of settlement, there was more curiosity than hostility between the Aborigines and the new tribe from Britain. as can be seen in this painting by Lieutenant Bradley, which captures them dancing together. But 18 months in, quite suddenly, the Aborigines began to die. Not by the musket, but by something even more devastating: smallpox. You said that smallpox took Arabanu. Was that something that was known on the Australian continent before the Europeans arrived?
Probably the greatest mystery of early Australian history is where this smallpox came from, and there's a number of alternative theories. One is that perhaps Indonesians brought it into northern Australia and it had been working its way down and just happened to break out when the first fleet arrived. Another one was that it was aboard the French fleets, because there was a French expedition that met the first fleet in Botany Bay at the time it arrived. But none of them make sense much, because the smallpox breaks out after 18 months. So where was it all of that time? But once it broke out, it spread like wildfire.
The beaches were strewn with the dead and dying, and no one had an answer for how it got into the population. The First Fleet surgeon, John White, brought with him a piece of material imbued with a smallpox sample. It was locked away for the purposes of inoculation. Could it have been tampered with? Do you reckon this was done deliberately?
Oh, absolutely not. It's clear from the reaction of everyone, from Governor Phillip down and the surgeon and others. They came around to caves like this all around the harbour, finding dead and dying Aboriginal people in them, and did their very best to help them. And in fact, they brought Aboriginal children who were suffering from smallpox back to the settlement and fed them and looked after them. And so I don't think it was deliberate at all. It was a great tragedy. Australian history is this strange paradox. Often people see it as a war between black and white and the conquest of a continent, and that's true at some levels, but there were deep friendships built, and there was, in the earliest days, I think, mutual respect.
I can't help feeling a bit sorry for Governor Phillip in a strange sort of way. Not only did he attempt to bridge the enormous cultural abyss that existed between the Aboriginals and the Europeans in a really heavy-handed way and failed entirely, but 18 months later, all the Aboriginal population around here was decimated by a disease that may well have been brought in by Phillip's men. Not a great start to a new colony. But Phillip was nothing if not persistent. He kidnapped 2 more Aboriginal men, Bennelong and Colby. And you could say it was a success of sorts. As odd as it seems, Bennelong and the governor did develop a friendship. Bennelong learned English and called Phillip father. But Governor Phillip was less successful at controlling the behaviour of the convicts and Marines. The list of grievances committed against the original inhabitants was growing daily. One day, without any warning, Bennelong disappeared, and Phillip was said to be devastated. So when Bennelong sent a message to Phillip asking him to meet at a beach across the harbour, he set off without hesitation. What occurred next, right here in Manly Cove, is one of the defining events in early colonial history. OK, so there was Phillip on the beach.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Well, he saw his friend Bennelong.
Yeah.
Tried to greet him. Bennelong thought that he'd give him a bit of whale meat. There was a beached whale here.
Yeah.
And that was always a bounty for the Eora-speaking people.
Yeah.
But Bennelong was evasive, and Phillip noticed a man he'd never met before, an Aboriginal from up in the Broken Bay area, standing up here, further on the beach.
What was the other guy's name?
Willemering.
Willemering, yeah, so he's over here. And what's his demeanour?
His demeanour is not evasive, it's grim. And so Phillip, being a curious Enlightenment man, comes up and tries to reassure him.
Yeah.
He thinks the man is suffering from the first contact trauma.
Yeah.
And the man is aggressive, steps back, and drives the spear through his shoulder.
I don't think you'd have been laughing quite this much. What happened to him?
Phillip immediately staggers, of course. The men think that there is a massacre on. They're very worried. They got him back to the boat.
Yeah.
with this in him.
Still in him?
Yeah.
All right, yeah.
It had gone through. They had to row him way up the harbour
Yeah.
to Sydney, 7 miles. And up there, he said, no retaliation. I don't want anything done. The shaft was taken out by a less than brilliant surgeon named Balmain, after whom a Sydney suburb is named. And Philip, through that ordeal, still kept saying no retaliation.
Philip could be forgiven for thinking he'd survived an attempted assassination, but somehow he understood that he was being sent a message. Philip recovered and sent his men to find Bennelong to show there were no hard feelings. Eventually, a meeting was arranged, and Philip in his boat met Bennelong in his canoe on the harbour. Soon after, Bennelong and his family moved to Sydney and occupied a small stone hut on the point where the Opera House now stands. It's been known as Bennelong Point ever since. Philip's original intention to develop friendly relations with the locals seemed to be finally coming to fruition. Other Aborigines from round the harbour became regular visitors to the camp. But sadly, this promising period wasn't to last. There was tension in the air, and one incident would combust into guerrilla warfare. The convict John McIntyre was gamekeeper for Philip and his officers. Food was scarce, and his ability to shoot native animals for their table made him a popular and valuable member of the colony. But he relied heavily on Aboriginal hunters, including one man in particular called Pemulwuy. He was a great hunter, respected by everyone who knew him. But there were those like McIntyre who were wary of the powerfully built Aboriginal, and perhaps with good reason. In time, Pemulwuy would become Australia's first guerrilla leader. So if Pemulwuy was offering them food from the bush, then McIntyre had to deal with him.
He certainly did. If not him, then someone else. And the idea of someone else grew, I think, in McIntyre's mind. And eventually, I think McIntyre decided to kill him. After all, this was the beginning of the age of Terra Nullius. Pemulwuy wasn't really human in the British sense, but he was a very dangerous man. So McIntyre knew this. He had to be pretty clever in doing this. And McIntyre said, well, look, so let's talk about this. You put down your weapon, I'll put down mine. McIntyre came out to talk to him with a bunch of armed New South Wales Corps with him. And McIntyre took his pistol, cocked it, put it on the ground, and Pemulwuy threw down his spear. And no sooner the spear hit the ground, when you could imagine these two looking at each other, it was like the ultimate metaphor, you know, the known and the unknown looking at each other. The particular weapon that Pemulwuy used was a weapon designed for homicide. It had all sorts of barbs on it, and these things usually kill people. And McIntyre dived down and grabbed the pistol. Pemulwuy flicked the spear up into his hand and threw it. By the time the pistol went off, he'd been hit by Pemulwuy's spear. So it happened pretty quick. McIntyre died. Philip sent out a huge military expedition after him. When I say huge, it was about 50 or 60 men, but in those days, 50 or 60 armed men. I think there was something like 40 privates involved. They had drummers, they had a surgeon, so it was substantial.
And it was war, you think?
I think it was war, and I think that was the act of war. When Pemulwuy struck McIntyre with that spear.
So once the war had been sparked, how did it operate?
Well, then Pemulwuy's people started to attack the settlers. And I think Pemulwuy always wanted to do that in any case. I mean, the British were armed with firearms, muskets. Pemulwuy's people were armed with spears and shields and boomerangs, etc. Then you'd wonder how they could stand up to each other for any length of time. But they weren't the real weapons. The real weapons were the ones you didn't see. For Pemulwuy, they were fire. Pemulwuy used fire then as a weapon. He used it now to prevent the British growing grain, particularly, and it was the wheat fields he attacked. And the British responded. The British knew what he was about. They responded by creating what they call the grain patrols. There were skirmishes of various sorts between them, and they were pretty serious casualties. I mean, there were hundreds of people were killed in this war.
On both sides?
On both sides, and keep in mind, there wasn't that many people here at the time.
Pemulwuy led as many as 100 fighters, including some escaped Irish convicts. This was organised strategic guerrilla warfare that lasted 12 years. Pemulwuy was reportedly shot several times, but fought on. It took a bounty hunter to finally bring him down in 1802. The fact that the Aboriginals organised an uprising against the British colonists and that it lasted 12 years is just a footnote in most histories of Australia, as is the fact that his head was removed from its body, pickled, sent to England, and was kept in the British Museum until it was lost. But there's an interesting twist to this story. Just recently, the grandson of the present British monarch, Prince William, has been enlisted to try and find Pemulwuy's head and return it to Australia. I hope he's successful. With the death of Pemulwuy, the resistance eventually lost its direction. Progress and development were now irresistible. For the early convicts, this meant enormous changes were on the way. Despite the rocky start, the penal colony eventually got on its feet. When Charles Darwin, the world's most famous naturalist, visited the colony in the early 1800s, he said, "As a place of punishment, the object is scarcely gained. But as a means of converting vagabonds most useless in one hemisphere into active citizens of another, and this giving birth to a new and splendid country, it has succeeded to a degree perhaps unparalleled in history." By the turn of the century, starvation was quelled, as was the Aboriginal uprising. And as more and more convicts completed their sentences, some decided to make a go of it as free men and women. Sydney today isn't recognisable from the early settlement, but the clues to life in the early 1800s are still there. All you have to do is dig them up. Ironically, some of the oldest finds are buried underneath a youth hostel. This is a great place to stay, particularly if you like archaeology, because all you have to do is get up, take a few deep breaths, and here it is right outside Australia's biggest ever archaeological dig. This amazing site has been responsible for smashing more than a few myths about the way convicts lived in the early days. You have had some gorgeous finds out of this place, haven't you?
We've had a lot of material from the 18th and 19th century which has turned up from this site. Almost 1 million objects, in fact.
What's that?
This piece here is probably an anchovy paste bottle, but it has a scene from the Battle of Balaclava, the charge of the Light Brigade. So it would have been a common sort of a theme that people would have liked and had on their tables and reminded them of events in Britain. A couple of 100,000 bones have been found on the site. So this half of the archaeological site was where George Cribb had his butchering process.
And George Cribb was?
George Cribb's one of the heroes of the site. He was a convict. By his occupation, he was a butcher. Just yesterday, we uncovered this platform here. We think that perhaps this might have been where they brought in the cows and slaughtered them.
So this was a man who started off as a convict, and in a very little time he was running his own business.
Yeah, well, he's a really interesting character. Firstly, we can take the legitimate side, and that was that he's running his butchery practice here. Within 2 or 3 months, he's advertising meat for sale to ships going back to Britain or going off whaling or whatever. But on the illegal side, we know that he was picked up on 2 occasions for dealing with illegally distilled alcohol, so running a still. And on each occasion, he managed to escape the law. So there was a suspicion there, but they never managed to actually sort of find any evidence.
But you have?
But we have. Because when we were excavating the backyard of George's butcher shop, we found a well, and it included a small still. So it would have been used for distilling small amounts of alcohol. It was buried around about 1818, which coincides with the time that George managed to get a legitimate pub licence, and he built his pub, the Turk's Head, next door to where this was found.
You caught him red-handed.
Well, except it was about 170, 180 years too late, but you know, it sort of gives a bit of an insight.
This is extraordinary to me. You've got convicts who have got country estates, they've got racehorses, they're running pubs, they're rentier landlords. Not such a bad life.
No, well, George even built a row of tenements in the back of the property, just behind where we're standing, which he rented out to other convicts. I mean, being a convict was like being a public servant most of the time, and didn't really feel like a prison. It was a free society, but the sentence was that you had to be in this place. The ability to make a new life is just phenomenal.
This was George's little empire. This was his house, here was his shop, here was his hotel, the Turk's Head. Behind him, he had a run of tenement houses. He had a well over there. This was a seriously successful businessman. In fact, he was so successful that he wrote to his nephew in Wiltshire and persuaded his nephew to do exactly the same thing that George had done, commit a felony, get convicted, get transported to Australia, and there he joined his uncle. But then things started to go wrong because the nephew immediately had a very public affair with George's wife, which was, of course, a great humiliation. And after that, George lost his house and his shop and his hotel and his butchery, even his racehorses, and became a bankrupt. After that, he disappears from the pages of history into obscurity. Convicts with talent and ambition were vital to the transformation of the colony from a shambolic tent city to a viable going concern. This very beautiful and very, very English church, St James's, started life as a courthouse, took 5 years to complete, it was finished in 1824, and that spire used to be a landmark for approaching ships. But what I find really intriguing about it is that the architect was a convict. In fact, Australia's first convict architect, Francis Greenway. Greenway had been an architect in England, but went bankrupt. It's been suggested that Greenway committed fraud to get a free passage to Australia, but that's a pretty high-risk strategy given that he was initially sentenced to death. We do know that he saw himself as a gentleman convict, as you can see in this tableau of his life in prison, which he painted during transportation to the colony. And he came with a letter of recommendation from none other than Arthur Phillip. Within a decade, he was the colony's most eminent architect. In fact, so much so that over 100 years later, his work was celebrated in the new Australian $10 bill. That is the only face of a convicted forger ever to appear on a banknote, and it's Francis Greenway. And he wasn't alone. Down in Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, one convict even became a media mogul who created Hobart's biggest daily newspaper. His name was John Davies. He was transported from England in 1831, still a teenager, for the slightly ludicrous crime of purchasing a candle on another man's account. You are the great-great-granddaughter of a thief and a rogue and a convict, aren't you?
I am.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm quite proud of him. I'm quite proud of him. He was all of those things, but he rose above it and made a really good life for himself in Australia.
Why was he sent here in the first place?
Well, he actually came out under the assisted passage scheme for fraud.
You mean he was transported?
He was transported, yes.
It is extraordinary how he rocketed up the administrative ladder when he got here.
He certainly did. He moved from being a ticket of leave man to a chief constable to a newspaper reporter and then finally a newspaper proprietor.
John Davies went on to create one of Australia's greatest media dynasties. But to his dying day, he remained ashamed of his convict roots and went to extraordinary lengths to hide his past. So you've got this incredibly successful man, and yet when he died, his obituary was full of the most ridiculous spin, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Do you think he wrote it before he died?
I think he probably did. Tell us the kind of things that it said.
He had supposedly worked on the Manchester Guardian in Britain. He had come to Australia via India, where he'd worked on the Englishman in Calcutta. He'd been on one of the first expeditions to Afghanistan. He'd been shipwrecked in Bass Strait on King Island and had to swim for his life, and then finally arrived in Hobart. All complete and utter fabrication.
His dad worked in newspapers when he got to Australia. He did, his kids did. The paper was in your family till the 1970s. You are the Murdochs of Tasmania, aren't you?
That's right, and now Murdoch owns it. So it's
Oh, you're joking?
No.
So another great newspaper family has taken over from you. It's a dog-eat-dog world in publishing, isn't it?
That's right, yes.
It's incredible to me that the convicts were in many cases more respectable than the people who were sent to guard them. The Redcoats, better known as the Rum Corps, were charged with upholding the law. But they weren't known for abiding by it. Some of them became rich beyond their wildest dreams. What a weird place New South Wales was in the early 1800s. Emancipated convicts, who a few years before were living in poverty on the streets of London, were getting rich. But it wasn't just the convicts who made the most of the opportunities that the new colony gave them. The people who looked after them, or were supposed to, the soldiers, they could rise and rise and rise. And it didn't seem to matter if they were argumentative and dysfunctional and generally stroppy. That could be an absolute advantage to them. It certainly was in the case of John MacArthur, who'd arrived in the settlement in 1790 as a penniless lieutenant, but then because of land deals and because of his trade, he dealt in rum apart from anything else, made a lot of money. But he was incredibly stroppy. If he didn't like someone, he would want to fight them. He would have duels with them. In fact, one particular duel that he became involved in was really significant. It not only changed Australia's history, but it changed its landscape forever. Stephen, what was the issue that this duel was around?
That's a good question, Tony. I think historians have been trying to understand John MacArthur's mindset for generations. MacArthur exposed some letters that put his commanding officer of the New South Wales Corps, Colonel Patterson's wife, in a bad light, and Colonel Patterson was offended. Now, for Colonel Patterson, that breaks the code of gentlemanly conduct. So he challenges MacArthur to a duel.
What were the rules of these kinds of duels?
Well, the rules were codified in the 1770s.
Yeah.
But they were often changed. For example, in this duel with MacArthur and Patterson, there was a toss of a coin.
What was the coin tossing all about?
If you won the toss, you fired first.
You fired first?
That's right.
I thought duels were supposed to be 12 paces, you take out your guns and you shoot each other.
Well, normally, that's correct. Someone would drop a handkerchief or make a signal and you would both present and fire. However, there were certain variations, and we don't know why this was chosen.
Time for the guns. So we just pick one?
Take one.
I'll be Patterson, all right?
You're Patterson.
OK.
Shall we toss a coin?
Oh, all right, yeah, we have to toss the coin first.
Heads.
Heads it is.
I win. I get to shoot you.
Great.
Unless I miss, and then it's your right to return fire.
Right.
Now, I shall mark out 12 paces.
How do I stand?
Stand as side on as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And your arm behind your back.
Yeah.
Make yourself less of a target. And I shall raise my pistol and fire first.
And you just get to fire at me? Wait for it. Oh! All right, carry on.
The surgeon would come in and determine whether the duel was over or whether you could, in fact, continue firing. But Surgeon Harris was the attendant surgeon, and he decided Patterson could not carry on. It took a while for Patterson's life to be stabilised. He was seriously wounded. So that was the end of the duel.
But it wasn't actually Patterson that MacArthur was after, was it?
No, it was Governor King.
So what was his reaction?
Governor King then investigated the duel, obviously. Now, duelling was illegal in the army, but if it went through a certain court process, legal process, and analysed, then people wouldn't be charged with murder, necessarily. But he had trouble investigating MacArthur, so he decided that he would send him back to England on a court-martial, as it was against army rules.
And, of course, the irony was that that court-martial could have been the end of MacArthur, but it was the making of the man.
Exactly.
A lot of people must have thought it was a good idea to rid the colony of the troublesome lieutenant, but MacArthur's good luck didn't end with the duel. When he got to England, his court-martial was quashed, so he was a free man. And he went round telling everyone that Australia could be Britain's next wool provider, because it was the Napoleonic Wars at that time, and Britain had lost its usual supply of wool from Spain. One of the people who heard him was a senior government minister called Lord Camden, who arranged for MacArthur to be given a land grant of a massive 5,000 acres of prime land in New South Wales, on which he could raise sheep. And all of this is the land that MacArthur was granted. And his luck didn't end there. On the boat out to England, he'd met the son of the Prince of Wales's doctor, which is a pretty obscure royal connection, I know, but he'd used it to have a look at the king's sheep. In fact, he actually managed to bring a few of them back to Australia, and they were the best wool producers in England and perfectly suited to Australian conditions. And these are the direct descendants of those royal sheep. Am I supposed to kneel or something? This stuff, as well as a workforce of ex-convicts, not only transformed a poor, lowly, hot-tempered lieutenant into the richest man in Australia by far, but it also turned the fledgling colony into a rich nation whose wealth and good fortune rode on the sheep's back. For over a century, Australia has been the largest wool producer on the planet. Arthur Phillip, the first governor of New South Wales, returned to England in poor health after just 5 years running the colony. Every record shows he was a committed and compassionate man who was often frustrated with the challenges he faced. It's easy to imagine that he went home with what today we'd call stress leave. But in the decades that followed, the colony fared better than he could have imagined. In just a few generations, it went from terra incognita, whose coastline was unknown, to one of Mother England's most highly valued assets, a transformation unparalleled in the history of the world. And the best was yet to come. Next time, I'm going to explore the first rumblings of dissent in the colony as the convicts find voice and rise up. Fire at him, but you're firing at him. OK, so this is Bligh.
This is Bligh.
And they found him hiding under a bed. And I'll discover the black sheep from my own family. Yes, folks, it turns out I've got a skeleton in my own closet. It's really exciting. He put on a kangaroo skin and bounded out of Port Arthur.
Next on SBS, a look into the TV shows that defined a decade. Stay tuned for the 80s.